Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have such an inspirational show coming right up. Our first guest is Maryn McKenna, and she's a journalist and author who specializes in public health, global health, and food policy. And she's here today to talk to us about her new book, Big Chicken. So Maryn writes about science and food for National Geographic and for magazines and websites across U.S. and Europe, including the New York Times, NPR, Newsweek, Vice, Wired, Scientific American, Slate, and many other media outlets. So let's welcome to the show, Maryn.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You know, I am so excited we're spending this time to talk about this. My goodness, you, and for our listeners that are not familiar with you, I mean, you have really kind of made this like a life calling and kind of diving into like public health and global health.
It's true. So I'm a journalist, and public health and global health, those are what I think of as my specialties. I've spent a lot of time traveling around the world, pursuing various investigators from the CDC and teams from the World Health Organization and so forth. And it's about 10 years ago now that I really got interested in this topic, this profound threat of antibiotic resistance, the ability of antibiotics to bacteria to defeat the antibiotics that we, send at them to kill them, and how important a health threat it is worldwide. And so now this new book, Big Chicken, is the result of my latest research.
I can imagine. I mean, it's so well written, and I love how it goes. Your book is kind of actually a third talks about some of the history, and then we talk about where we're kind of at now, and then there's hope.
That really made a difference to me in doing this. Is that my previous book, Superbug, is a really dark story. It's the story of how antibiotic resistance expanded worldwide, and there's a lot of really bad things that happened to people in that book. And so when I did my next one, I wanted it to be a story that had some hope in it. And though the story of Big Chicken is a story that goes to some pretty dark places, I do feel like there are positive turns at the end that show us the way to reform and introduce us to people who are actually working on making things better.
Well, I think it's important to, understand where it is that we are so we can make changes and make some transformation. Because otherwise, I mean, we are kind of just alone and, kind of in the dark, not really knowing exactly how this is impacting not just our health personally, but our environment as well.
Right. I really wanted people to understand how all the strands of this are knitted together, so just to sort of set the stage. I mean, this is the story of how we came to give antibiotics routinely to most of the meat animals on the planet, which is a practice that dates back to the very beginning of the antibiotic era, to the late 1940s and early 1950s. Since then, routine antibiotics, tiny doses, far too small, than cure an infection, have been a routine component of the diet of the chickens and pigs and cattle that we eat. And while that gave us the most efficient, most consistent system on the planet for producing protein very, very cheaply, it also created this huge threat of antibiotic-resistant bacteria moving off farms, and also helped farms scale up to the very large livestock operations that we have today that cause grave disruption to the environment and have completely changed our relationship to animal welfare and to how we think of how often we should eat protein as well.
Yeah, I know there's thank goodness, a big shift now where people are looking at not just how animals, are kind of sourced and taken care of, but, what the environments are that they're in. Because I know when I go to the store, I'm always looking for specific, like if I'm looking for eggs, I'm looking for the kind that the chickens can roam free, they're in the pasture, running around doing their thing, because it makes a difference on how that all kind of trickles down.
Right, exactly. So it was antibiotics that made it possible for us to bring animals indoors and grow them fully indoors. And that's the situation in particular with chicken, which is why chicken is the story through which I tell this tale, because chickens were the first animals to get growth promoter antibiotics experimentally back in the 1940s. And chicken, in a sense, taught the rest of animal agriculture how to misuse antibiotics by demonstrating that you could routinely give these doses and have animals either grow faster to their slaughter weight or grow in the same amount of time but using less feed, and how that encouraged putting more animals into barns and sort of treating them like widgets, moving through a production system, and how that impaired animal welfare, and how once we figured out that a little antibiotic did that effect, that a little bit more antibiotic would also protect animals from the diseases that other animals carried, so we could pack them in even more and more.
I think that's just horrible. If you look at that and you look at the overall health of the animal, and and most people, I think, until you start to raise some questions, and also your great book, Big Chicken, I mean, a lot of people don't really put into consideration like how these animals are treated before they are, they go to the production line and they become food on our table.
Yeah, so it's really odd that the history of chicken in the United States is kind of a history of unintended consequences, and it's unintended consequences especially of technological innovations that at the time people were very proud of. Long ago, 2 or 3 generations ago, our grandparents or great-grandparents had, just hens out the back door or in the barnyard, and the main purpose of chicken was to give you eggs, and you only ate the chicken when the eggs were when she was like not laying eggs anymore. Then someone invented the electric incubator, so you could take the hen off her eggs and hatch them artificially and keep her just pumping out more and more eggs. After the electric incubator came synthetic vitamins added to the diet, and after that came growth promoter antibiotics added to the diet, and after they could produce chicken more rapidly and cheaply, they still had to figure out how to make people want to eat more chicken, because the chickens were still were more related to the scrawny birds that our grandparents would have raised. And so we get from there to vast alterations through intensive crossbreeding in the shape of chicken. And that way we get to the chickens that we eat today, which I think if people saw them, they would not really match what is in your mind when you think of chicken, because the modern broiler chickens are very, very heavy in the breast, because we in the United States like white meat. And they're always white feathered, because white feathers the skin under white feathers looks cleaner when the feathers are pulled out. And they're always very docile. They're not feisty like a backyard bird. They basically just get up, eat, drink, and sit back down again in their barns. And they have appetites that have been stimulated by crossbreeding to such a degree that if you let them, they might eat themselves to death.
Wow. That is just amazing. I mean, growing up, we had chickens in our backyard, and we had a couple white ones, and a checkered one, and a couple of the red ones, and I mean, they were feisty.
They are, yeah. So in the research for this book and trying to understand what had happened to chicken, trying to trace this path that antibiotics started, I ended up at an amazing farm that's in the middle of Kansas. I mean, in the middle of the prairie. There's nothing anywhere around it except one tiny town. It's called Good Shepherd Poultry Ranch, and it is the creation of one man, Frank Grief, who keeps alive all the strains of chicken that the modern industrial chicken rejected. Like, as we got to this very fat, very docile white bird, there used to be, as you say, birds that were big and small and brown and gray and striped and checkered, and birds that were feisty, and birds that were good mothers, and birds that could withstand great heat and could withstand great cold. And Frank keeps all of those alive. He breeds the lines through generation after generation, partly just because he loves them, but also because he believes that those genetics need to be protected, because we will need to take them back into the breeding of chicken once again. And it's people like that that really give me hope that this is not just a story of darkness, that there are people in all kinds of ways that are all around the story of chicken, including some people who work for big food companies who really want to see the raising of animals and the turning of animals into meat be a better process that more respects evolution, more respects the rights of the animal, more respects what we really want out of our food.
Yeah, I've heard you talk on other shows in regards to, being in environments where, let's say you're around turkeys, and the turkeys were, these big, huge, beautiful birds, and that's not kind of what I know. I've seen pictures of in mass farming when they farm animals, and it's not quite that same way with turkeys if they're kept inside, or it's a mess.
Well, I think we're all pretty familiar at this point with the concept of hybrid seed, right?
Mm-hmm.
That farmers who grow row crops can't save seed and have it breed true. They have to go back to the companies every time they want to plant again. They have to go back to a hybrid corn, hybrid soybeans, and so forth. Well, poultry's the same way. Chicken and turkeys at this point are intellectual property. They belong, the genetics of all the broiler chicken that we grow in the world belongs to two companies. And what we might think of as like heritage or open source chickens, they're only out in farms like the ones that Frank Reese raises. So the chickens and turkeys in industrial barns, they don't mate. They don't breed with each other. Turkeys physically can't. They've been so changed in their shape by crossbreeding, by modern intensive hybridization, that they literally can't mate naturally. They have to be artificially inseminated. And wow. So our idea of chicken is the people like Frank are seed savers of chicken. And where I think people, especially on smaller farms and more modern farms, and the people who are coming into the food system now, what they really want is kind of for chicken to be open source again, for us to have chickens of different weights and different heights and different colors, chickens that can be good both for raising eggs and also for raising meat, chickens that might be, again, like what our grandparents raised.
Yeah. And that was before anyone was thinking about, putting antibiotics in their food and what have you. And so you talk about that quite a bit in your book, of course, and how antibiotics have really created this resistant strain. So what kind of problems do you see arising from this?
So the problem with using antibiotics, with the people who did this to start with didn't think that antibiotic resistance would ever move off the farm. They thought that if any antibiotic-resistant bacteria arose from the misuse of antibiotics, it would just be something that would stay with the animal. They never anticipated that antibiotic-resistant bacteria would be a thing that could move through the environment, that could transfer to people on meat, or that could move worldwide. They really just had a failure of vision, and that failure of vision has left us with this global problem of antibiotic-resistant bacteria rising as we run out of the antibiotics we need to cure them.
Yeah. It just seems like they had all these great intentions, and it's interesting. They probably started off as the hero in some ways, and as generations go on, it's kind of how interesting how history will look at all that.
This is a story of unintended consequences. I mean, I really try to keep in mind that almost all the people that I write about in this 70-year history had good intentions. In the 1940s, when they were starting to put antibiotics routinely into animal feed, when they were doing the first experiments, they wanted to make up for the fact that in the wake of World War II, the food system was really fragile, and many types of food production had been destroyed. Many of the fishing fleets had been taken away to be part of the war effort. There had been storms, and there had been armies rolling over arable land, and so overall, even here in the United States, the food supply was really fragile. And so finding a way to cut costs in producing food while keeping food nutritious was an obsession. And the original use of antibiotics in farm animals to increase their growth was a way to be able to use cheaper feed with a cheap supplement, because those first antibiotic doses came from manufacturing waste that the companies were going to throw away before they standardized the dose. And similarly, the way our chickens are shaped now, with these very breasty chickens that can, are sort of unsteady and can barely stand up on their own, that was because they wanted to give the consumer what they thought the consumer wanted. And in the United States, what consumers want is white meat. So they grew in this contest in the 1950s called the Chicken of Tomorrow contest. Mm-hmm. They grew a bird that they said would have a breast you could slice like a steak. And so all of these things were in response to things that various authorities thought that we wanted, but they all ended us up in a place where we didn't really need to be.
Well, and I know in your book you talk about the progression of just how these different ranchers who had chickens, what they went through, and how one individual ended up getting more chickens than they had anticipated, and then they moved that from using those chickens for eggs, which was the needed thing at the time, to more for meat. And there was this kind of switch at that time that happened.
Right. That's the story of Cecile Steele, who was the wife of a Coast Guard officer living in Delaware, and she had an egg business. And as happens periodically, you have to replace your hens, and so she placed an order with a mail order hatchery for hen chicks that would grow up into hens that would lay eggs. And she ordered 50, and she got 500. And she didn't need that many eggs. And so she had the idea to do with her hens what farmers had episodically been doing with spare roosters in their flocks, because when hens lay eggs, they hatch out in a roughly 50-50 sex ratio, so many hens to so many roosters. But you don't really need the roosters. You only need one or two in a flock, so they would fatten up the roosters and sell them off very young, and that's where we get the phrase from the beginning of the last century, spring chickens, because that's when the roosters were fed and killed. So Cecile Steele thought, well, maybe I could do that with these hens. Maybe instead of using them all for egg production, I'll feed them the way I would the roosters, and I'll sell them for meat, and let's see what happens. And what happened was that she sold them, and she was very successful. And so she kept doing this. She bought birds, chicks, just with the intention of raising and selling them for meat. She bypassed her old egg business. And all of her neighbors, who were all sort of truck crop farmers in Delmarva, which is a very mild place with very mild weather and very fertile soil and very low to the ocean, the peninsula where Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia come together, they converted en masse to raising chickens. And they fed mostly the markets of Philadelphia and New Jersey and so forth, and New York. And that worked really well. That was the start of sort of the industrial chicken in the United States until World War II came along. And then the government, which needed a reliable supply of protein for the troops, kind of nationalized the entire production of Delmarva, which, being a peninsula, had only a couple of roads in and out. And that abstraction of Delaware from the market gave the place where I live, Georgia, its foothold to becoming the poultry capital of the world. In the United States, we produce almost 9 billion broiler chickens a year, and here in Georgia, I live in Atlanta, 1.4 billion of them a year are born and processed. If Georgia were a country, its chicken production would rank up there somewhere near China and Brazil. It's extraordinary. And living here in Georgia, you never have a sense that there are all these chickens growing around you, which just speaks to how we have abstracted protein production from sort of the everyday experience of our lives. We don't know where our meat is coming from. We just know it arrives.
Yeah, I grew up in California, and if you go through the Central Valley, you know there are cows there. There's no, you see the farms and other things too, so you have kind of a sense because you're a little bit more immersed in that. But even still, it's so different when you look at how, when we talk about adding food additives and growth hormones and how all these play a part in our food chain.
Right. So one thing is that hormones, it's kind of odd actually. If you go to the supermarket and you pick up a package of chicken, it will say, no cages, no hormones. Well, actually, no meat chicken in the United States has ever been raised in a cage or with growth hormones. Growth hormones in chicken are legal, but the companies make the claim because somebody made the claim somewhere on a label at some point. It became such a selling point that no one could ever give it up. And it's really just kind of a lesson to us in how carefully we need to read labels, how we have to be really critical of every sense, study everything that's on the label, and be sure that it's telling us the truth.
And just have an understanding that that's not even that's illegal anyway. So, I mean, of course they wouldn't have it.
Right. Like, for instance, as this, in this movement away from antibiotics that now actually is being led by some very large companies, there are one or two companies that are trying to make the claim that, well, our chicken is always antibiotic-free because the government says it has to be antibiotic-free. But what they're actually arguing about there is whether the flesh of the chicken has a residue of antibiotics in it. And it never does because that's tightly regulated by the government. But what we need people to understand is that the issue is not that there's antibiotic in the flesh, but antibiotics were used in its raising and generated antibiotic-resistant bacteria that might be on the meat or might be in the farm environment or might have moved away from the farm. But it's never a question of residue. So if people hear that in commercials saying, well, there's no residue on our meat, it's like, no, there isn't. And there never was.
And it's almost like splitting hairs there, so you really have to know what you're looking for and really understand how to find if you're going to be cooking chicken on your table, it's like, gosh, where am I getting this meat from? Is it coming from a place like Good Shepherd Poultry Ranch? I mean, there's got to be more of those around the country.
Right. So I think one thing that I take hope in is that just in the past couple of years, partly because of government action, but I believe mostly because of consumer pressure, the amount of poultry that's being raised without antibiotics has really expanded. And it's this really amazing sort of historic resonance in a way, because having been the animals that got antibiotics first in this manner, poultry kind of taught the rest of agriculture how to misuse antibiotics. And now with poultry companies turning away from antibiotic use, maybe poultry production will teach the rest of agriculture how to back away from antibiotic use. But now you can go into a supermarket, any supermarket. It doesn't have to be Whole Foods. It doesn't have to be a place that only sells organic. And you will be able to find chicken that is labeled raised without antibiotics. And the great thing about that is that it opens up, healthier, higher welfare chicken to a wider range of spending levels. So people who always bought their chicken from, the beautiful green pastured farm, the birds with the red feathers that spend their entire lives outside, have sort of a perfect chicken life. You can still do that. They were always antibiotic free. And then in the middle there were companies that were antibiotic free but maybe raised their birds indoors because they were in climates where birds couldn't go outside all the time the way they can here in Georgia. But now even the big producers, even people like Purdue and Tyson, have antibiotic-free lines in their portfolios, and therefore the price is lower than the price of the beautiful pastured bird. So it makes antibiotic-free meat something that's accessible to a much wider swath of the population, and that really makes me feel good, that reform is really percolating through the industry.
Yes, I've seen, it was a while back, but it was a commercial about it was a brand that sells chickens, and they're saying that they don't use any hormones, that they feed them herbs, and so it's kind of this movement more towards looking for a healthier approach or a more organic approach towards our animals. That's and then, the care of them throughout the entirety of it.
So it's really fascinating that some of the companies that have turned away from antibiotic use, so basically the antibiotics were there to protect the birds from disease as well as for growth promotion. But so if you're going to take those away, you have to find other ways to stimulate their immune system. Well, one way you do that is that you return to things that farmers used to give birds, like natural light. Purdue cuts windows in the holes of its barns, which were formerly solid walls. Maybe you give them more exercise. Maybe you put things in the barn like hay bales or pallets that they can jump up on. But some places, and a real pioneer in this was the Pennsylvania company Bell and Evans, who sell in Wegmans and in some Whole Foods. They have never given their birds antibiotics, and instead the diets are laced with things like thyme and oregano and cinnamon and yucca, and these are natural antimicrobials that have the same sort of sterilizing effect on the gut. But so diseases are defeated, but they don't have the effect of stimulating antibiotic-resistant bacteria.
Yeah. It really has such a great effect. Well, and so what direction do you see this industry going in? I know you've kind of given, with the last third of your book, you talk about solutions and some direction we're going through. But what are some of the ways that you think we're making some massive changes?
So I really think that the way that poultry in the United States is changing really is very positive, because that's so much less antibiotic use. At the same time, the federal data for agricultural use of antibiotics, so it lags by a couple of years, so we don't know what's happening right now. At the moment, we know what happened in 2015, and soon we'll get the numbers for 2016. Those numbers kept going up and up. So somewhere in agriculture, someone is using a lot of antibiotics in their animals, and we need to know where. So is chicken going to teach cattle and pigs how to do without antibiotics, or is there going to be some sort of covert kind of like shell game in which the drugs get moved around? And I think that the biggest thing that we have to keep in mind is that, microbes don't respect borders. So even if we are perfect in the United States in taking antibiotics out of meat agriculture, as they have done in Europe, who were ahead of us by about 10 years, there's still an awful lot of the world where people want to eat meat, where economies are growing just enough that people can just now start to afford meat, and they really want to eat meat. And so we have to help teach them. We have to teach the developing world that if they're going to do the kind of intensive agriculture that they'll need to do in order to supply the meat that their growing populations want, we have to help coach them to do it without antibiotics, to not make the same mistakes we made.
Yeah, that way they can make responsible choices overall and not be in the same predicament that we are.
Right. Well, I mean, we already know that because of misuse in agriculture and because of misuse in medicine, superbugs are moving across the world. We have infections recorded in the United States by the CDC of superbugs that we know originated in China and in India and in other places. There are also cases of superbugs that have originated in the United States that have moved around the world. We're not innocent. But we know that anything that gets done somewhere far away, the microbes will find their way. So we have to learn how to do without antibiotics in agriculture everywhere. That's the only thing that will really slow down this evolution of bacteria past all the antibiotics we have until it brings us back to a place where it's as if we never had antibiotics at all.
Well, Marianne, thank you. My gosh, thank you so much for taking the time to share your immense knowledge with us on this topic, and of course your amazing book, Big Chicken. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community?
I would love to see them at my site, bigchickenthebook.com. They can find me on Twitter at Maryn, MCK, and that's also my Instagram handle. And my personal site is marynmckenna.com.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us today.
I was thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for asking me.
Thank you. We're going to pause here for a quick break, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
Have you ever had the sense that your thoughts might actually be doing something? Ancient secrets of manifesting have been masterfully revealed in the award-winning book Manifesting 1-2-3 by Ken Elliott. For the first time, the author's experiences and stories in this book describe exactly how your thoughts can create anything. You've been doing this all your life, but it's never been fully explained for you until now. Visit manifesting123.com for more information today. Manifesting123.com.
This is Jennifer McGill. My highly anticipated new album, Unbreakable, is now available at jennifermcgill.com. Everything from power ballads to high-energy jam-out-in-your-car songs. I used my highest joys and deepest pains to create empowering songs of love, strength, healing, and restoration so that you can be unbreakable too. Get your copy of Unbreakable today from jennifermcgill.com. Because who doesn't want to be unbreakable?
The highly acclaimed and newly released book, The Hand Part 2 by Lynn Van Praagh Grattan, describes the journey between a psychic medium and a family who lost a son. Messages from Beyond Eternity's Gate is of love and healing. For more information, visit www.lynnvanpraagh-grattan.com. That's www.lynnvanpraagh-grattan.com.
Welcome back to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted to be introducing our next guest, Paula Shaw, and she's here today to talk to us about her book, Grief, When Will This Pain Ever End? Now, Paula is a grief and addiction therapist, best-selling author, keynote speaker, and radio show host. For more than 20 years, Paula has been passionate about helping people navigate the stress of change, challenge, and grief. So let's welcome to the show, Paula.
Thank you, Marianne. I'm delighted to be here today. I think we have lots to talk about.
I know we do. Most of it is not a laughing matter, but we've been having so much fun talking prior to the show. I'm so looking forward to this conversation as well. And do you know what? I think a lot of times when people talk about grief, it's kind of like they don't want to talk about it. It's like, ooh, it's the uncomfortable conversation.
It's so true. In fact, it's interesting. You mentioned the title of the book, When Will This Pain Ever End? And that actually was the first title I had on it. And then I added, because I wanted to avoid the word grief, because that's how people are. So I think you must have gotten that intuitively. Now I've changed the title to Grief, When Will This Pain Ever End? And I actually just did that because in doing some research, I saw that when people are in pain, they tend to Google or search the word grief if that's what's going on with them more than they do just pain. So I added that to the title, but I did it reluctantly because the truth is, you're so right, nobody wants to be a griever. Nobody wants to be experiencing grief. And yet nobody is going to get through life without experiencing it. You know, it's a given.
Yeah, and we're all going to experience it. We're all going to have loss or suffering of some type, throughout our lifetime. And it could be a loved one, it could be a pet, it could be a job, it can be a relationship. There are many different types of losses. And so I found your book to be so profoundly just not informative, but it had really good tools that people can put into place to kind of start walking through that, because you never get over it. You walk through it.
Well, I've been working with grieving people for 26 years, and one of the things I know is that when you're in that kind of emotional pain, you just don't have the ability to focus on a long book or something that's really intense, you know what I mean, or detailed. Yeah. So I created the chapters really short, like some of the chapters are only 3 pages, but then they're followed by articles, tools, and processes that you can pick and choose through to see what works for you. Because, as you well know, no one thing works for everybody. And so I tried to give a variety of processes, many from the field of energy psychology, where I do a lot of work and am one of the pioneers in that field, and then a lot of things like journaling, like breath work, different kinds of things that basically do help to shift your energy and move you through the grief. because it's just too easy for people to get stuck in their grief and their pain. You know, we get into that looping thinking, and every time you come back to what you lost, the pain wells up again, and you can just stay in that same place. So I think it's kind of a misnomer. You know, people think if I just hold on long enough, this will get better. And that's not necessarily true. You know, we have to do some kind of work with that grief, some kind of work to help shift the pain and shift our thinking. And then we can move through it.
Yeah, I mean, that old saying, time heals all wounds is really horrible, because sometimes it doesn't.
That's one of my pet peeve sayings. Actually, in the book, I talk about myths and misinformation about grief, and that's one of the myths, that time heals all wounds. Time takes the edge off the acuteness of your pain. But sometimes what I find, in 26 years of working with grieving people, time sometimes makes the grief much more complicated, or time just acts as like a fertile field for growing self-destructive behavior or phobias or other kinds of non-productive behavior patterns that actually evolve out of the unhealed grief.
Well, I've got a lot of questions around that, but I also have, because I feel like I'll get the cart before the horse on this one if I dive into those, because you did talk in your book, and we'll get to those in a minute, but you did talk in your book about the dimensions of grief energy, and I'd love for you to expand and share that for our listeners.
Yes. This is also something I'm passionate about, because, there is talk out there about the 5 stages of grief. And everybody thinks that if you don't go through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and I can't remember the last one. Anyway, the 5 stages. If you don't go through all 5 of those stages, you can't heal. And first of all, the 5 stages that we're talking about are the 5 stages of death and dying that were developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And they are not the same experience that a person goes through when you have lost someone that's dear to you. So what happens is people get stuck in that thinking, and then they think, if I haven't gone through depression or anger, I'll never be able to heal. And it's hard enough to heal from grief, when you've got everything going for you. But if you now think there's a prescribed pattern you have to walk through, that just makes things even more difficult. So what's really more accurate, and the way I like to think about grief, is there are different dimensions that come up that people experience, and one of those is like shock, disbelief, going through difficulty with trying to accept what's happened. You can't think clearly, you're in a fog. That's definitely one. Yes, depression, sadness, that can be another one of the dimensions. Phobias can evolve. That's a possible dimension. One that people don't talk about very much is that sometimes if you've lost a loved one to a certain disease, people start developing symptomatology of that same disease, and they don't even have it. There can be fear of the
so focused on it.
Exactly. We know, I work with energy in the field of energy psychology, and we know that whatever we feed energy to is going to grow. And, whatever we focus on, we're feeding energy to. So and that's one of the problems, I think, with grieving people. They tend to keep coming back to the story, whether it was an accident, whether it was a hurricane, whether it was somebody they love dying of cancer. They keep coming back to focusing on that thing, and so they're really just feeding that energy and growing that rather than being able to grow a more healing state where they can move into acceptance and then finally gratitude. But that's a long way down the road. Just to get somebody to acceptance is huge because, of course, the first words out of your mouth are why. You know, why did this happen? Why me, God? You know, that's what you hear people say all the time.
Yeah. It's getting kind of just in that place where they feel just hopeless, you know. And it's tough, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel.
There is a light at the end of the tunnel. And, you know, and one of the natural dimensions of grief is a sense of hopelessness and overwhelm. Sometimes people just get total loss of energy. They just can't focus on any kind of positive future at all. As far as they're concerned, life is over. Life is done. They can't imagine themselves getting past this. And, you know, this might be a good place to also mention that, you know, people tend to think grief is an emotion itself. You know, and you hear people say, how are you doing? Oh, I'm grieving. Well, yes, we are grieving, but what exactly does that mean? Grief is not an emotion. Grief is a genre of emotions. It's a collection of emotions. So you might experience a loss, and it might show up in a lot of anger. I might experience a loss, and it might show up in a paralyzing depression. Somebody else might experience a loss, and it might show up in anxiety that keeps them from ever being able to live their lives fully. Or all of those things can be combined in one person's loss. But so you need to understand that grief can show up in many, many different ways. And one of them is phobias. You know, people or kind of a restricted way of living. Especially what I've seen with a lot of clients is when something comes out of the blue and either kills somebody that they love or takes away a situation that they love, a job, a home, whatever, they tend to get really trepidatious in the way they live life because there's like this subconscious belief that evolves that says, you got to watch out. You got to be looking over your shoulder every minute because something can come up out of the blue and turn your world upside down.
Wow. And, you know, I'm so glad you touched on that because that's one of the questions I had here because I know you've helped thousands of people through the years of doing this, and it just wanted to see what that number one thing that you see that people get stuck in that they kind of struggle with moving through. And it sounds like it's if something happens very suddenly.
Mm-hmm. That is probably the biggest thing, you know, because I think when it comes more slowly, like one of the clients that I've recently been working with, her mom was in and out of hospice for a year. So she knew it was coming, you know what I mean? So there was no sudden upheaval of her world. But, of course, what people always say is even when they know it's coming, you cannot anticipate how it's going to feel. It's not like it's going to hurt less because you knew it was coming. But there isn't the surprise factor that tends to set up a mechanism in the subconscious mind that's like an alert, you know, because what we know is that the amygdala, that part of the brain that prepares us for fight, flight, or freeze, is always scanning our environment going, am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe? Well, when something like that happens, you know, that's a very deep learning for the brain. It's like, oh, my God, that came out of nowhere. We ought to be on the alert now so we don't get caught by that because that almost killed us. And that's all that your brain is concerned with. Not your happiness, not productive living, just your survival. And so if now creating a set of fears or a more a trepidatious or watchful attitude, if it feels like that's going to help you survive better, that's what it's going to set up.
Yeah. Now with, because I know you see grief in many different ways. It could be from veterans that have lost friends of theirs in the battlefield, people who have lost pets, people who have lost loved ones, people who lost jobs, maybe a way of life, whatever the loss is, maybe a divorce. When you are seeing people for this, do you see that sometimes there's a correlation between maybe, you know, overusing recreational drugs or alcohol abuse or anything like that that kind of ties in because they're trying to mask the pain or at least deal with the pain?
That is actually a huge point, Marianne. And in fact, in my next book, I'm focusing a lot on that because we actually call those behaviors, rather than addictions, they're referred to as grief avoidance response mechanisms. And what they are ways that we cope with the emotional pain of the grief. And so, again, talking about the brain and wanting you to survive, it knows that you can only handle so much emotional pain. So then if you find a substance or a behavior, that tends to soothe the pain or distract you, the pleasure center of your brain is going to drive you back to that activity or that substance over and over again because it feels like that's going to enhance your survival. So it's a real trap. It's a real difficulty. I see this kind of thing happening all the time. If you look at anybody's, in fact, years ago I wrote a program, or I proposed one to the National Alcohol Council, and it was called Grief Work, the Missing Piece in the Recovery Puzzle, because it's my belief that all self-destructive behavior emanates from unhealed grief and loss. And so when we're working with people in 12-step programs or other kinds of recovery programs, I think a big missing piece has been, let's look at the losses in their lives and whether or not they were ever healed, whether or not they ever got a chance to, actually come to the other side of this and reach a place of acceptance and being able to go forward, accepting the new normal. As you said before, we can't ever go back to the way things were before the loss. But sometimes the new normal can be even better than life was before the loss. But we have to do the work and the healing to get there.
So you talk about the work and the healing, and for a lot of people, because I know in your book you talk about forgiveness and the importance of that. And what if, let's start with, does everything need to be forgiven? What if it's something horrific, like a parent abusing a child, or uncle molesting a child, or whatever the case is. Just some horrific abuse that happened when they were growing up, and the person passes, and they feel that loss, but at the same time they're conflicted.
Sure.
And I've heard that happens more often than not, that people kind of feel stuck in this area. They're like, what the heck? I'm angry at him. I'm never going to forgive this person. And yet, what are we going to do, So how does someone move through forgiveness, and is a forgiveness, kind of an expected thing?
Well, that's a great question, because this is a huge, huge issue. And it's my belief that forgiveness is it's misunderstood more often than not, because, we're all raised with that idea, forgive and forget. But sometimes when something is truly heinous or has really impacted your life in a huge way, you're not going to forget it. But remember what I was saying a little bit ago about whatever we focus on, we feed energy to, and whatever we feed energy to is going to grow. So obviously it's not in our highest good to keep focusing on the perpetrator or the thing that was done to us that was painful. So, but we're probably not going to forget it either. So the way I look at forgiveness is really more of a statement like, I am no longer going to allow you to imprison me in bitterness and resentment. I release that bitterness and resentment, and I release you and what you did to whoever eventually, brings people to justice for what they do. But to focus on it, to get caught up in hatred and resentment and all that only keeps you imprisoned by whatever was done. The freedom comes in forgiveness. There's an amazing man who was on my radio show, on Transition Radio. His name's Azim Khamisa. I don't know if you've heard of him, but 18 years ago his son was shot by a gang member, 14 years old, who was doing an initiation thing. Yeah, he's amazing.
Him a while back too. Yeah, he's absolutely amazing.
His whole life is transformed because he was able to forgive this kid that killed his son. And now he has a foundation that's helping other people to learn about this so that no one else is going to lose their child that way. And Azim is one of the most beautiful human beings I've ever encountered because he realized that to stay, locked in bitterness and hatred was only going to imprison him. And so I think that's an example for all of us. So we just have to have the attitude that we want to let go of all that negative energy that's impacting us and leave the perpetrators to, facing their God or justice or whatever is going to come to them. But forgiveness is an important piece because it takes our focus off the negative thing that happened and expands it back out into what's beautiful in life and what we want to create in our own experience.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a journey, and you hear people talking about different pains they go through, but how they also can transition that into something beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Azim's a perfect example. I think that's one of the hardest parts of grief for everybody. Obviously we don't grieve if we didn't lose something we really cherish. And whether it was our job, our home, our animal, our mother, our father, our child, whatever it was, we cherished it and we liked things the way they were. This is another interesting part of humans and human life. We don't like change. We hate the discomfort of change. And yet without change, we can't create anything new and we would get bored to death. So there's this love-hate relationship with change. Well, grief upheaves things the way they were, and so it's not comfortable anymore. Now we're forced to deal with a change, and maybe a change that was the one thing in the world we dreaded. And yet, through that change, we have an opportunity for growth.
It moves us into a place of ultimate transition. Where we can move through that, and then we realize how much stronger we are going through all that.
Absolutely.
It's like, hey, I was able to deal with that, but it's not going to define me.
Mm-hmm. And, I actually believe that every one of us deals with some kind of loss every day. They may be little small losses, a loss of faith in somebody or a loss in looking at something a certain way, a loss of faith in what we thought our country or our parents or our church or whatever stood for, but we're always dealing with loss. And loss gives us this opportunity, just like you were just saying, to go in, to deal with the pain, and then to look at how we really feel and get a stronger resolve about what we believe, what we know, and who we are. So it really serves a huge purpose. In the Sanskrit beliefs, and in the Hindu, they talk about the goddess Kali, and she's the destroyer. And everybody, thinks, oh, Kali, she's so terrible. But no, if nothing is destroyed, nothing new can be created.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about, and we touched on this a little bit, the power of intention. Mm-hmm. How can we use that to heal?
Well, the way I like to think about intention is, quantum physics has taught us that energy is random. And everything in the universe, even our thoughts and our behavior patterns, everything is made up of particles and waves of energy. So the way I look at it, we all have a choice every day. We can either cast our fate to the wind, or we can tell those particles and waves of energy how we would really like them to show up. And that's what setting intention does. I never do a radio show. I don't get out of bed in the morning until I have set an intention about how I want that day to look. If I've got a tough phone call to make or a tough session to walk into, I set an intention first of what I would like the outcome to be. And then that way you're doing what you can because we have been taught by quantum physics that energy shows up in accordance with the expectations of the observer. Mm-hmm. So let's think about that. You're always hearing people say, we create our reality. But until I knew those words I just spoke to you, I never knew how we created our reality. Well, now I know. It's because you impose your idea, your will, your desire on those particles and waves of energy and tell them how you'd like them to show up. And I'm telling you, more days turn out just the way I wanted them to. I have so many more happy days than I do difficult days. And I mean, obviously, we've been talking about grief here. We've been talking about unexpected upheaval. We can't control the universe. We can't control things that happen. We can't control what happens in the government every day. But we can control how we respond to it. And I think that if we come at all the diversity, or not diversity, but adversity in our lives with a spirit of, okay, where is the gift in this? Where is the place where I can grow? Where is the place that I know things are going to work out, where my faith can grow, my ability to look at myself can grow, my ability to ask for help can grow, my ability to work with others can grow. That's the only reason we go through all these things that are difficult, because they're opportunities for growth. And like it or not, this seems to be Earth School, and we came here to grow.
It is, for sure. Yeah, and it's such a journey because, with everything that we go through, it's kind of like, gosh, sometimes it feels like this pain is so much, it's going to take me out. And when we work through it and are able to work on ourselves and kind of walk through it, it's like, gosh, okay, I made it through that. And then when the next big pain comes, it's like,
exactly.
Ooh, I feel that. It's like, oh, it's a shot to the chest, but what it really is kind of an ability for us to kind of reach different levels of awareness for ourselves of what we can do as a human, as a being.
Mm-hmm. And it tends to build our repertoire, if you will, of things we know we can survive. One of the things that always broke my heart about working with younger people, like I've worked with 15-year-olds who were suicidal, and one of the things that always breaks my heart about the young kids is they haven't had as many years of life experience as we have to know that 9 times out of 10 everything works out. And even when it doesn't seem to work out, down the road you realize the growth opportunity that was there for you, or what you learned that helped you at another point in life. But when you're young, it's, a disaster seems like a disaster that's never going to get better. And that pain feels like it's never going to go away. And, the one good thing as we go down the road of life is we do realize that, the sun will come out tomorrow, that there will be a better day, and that this isn't going to define the rest of our lives or define us. Any one event is not going to do that.
No, it's a part of our journey because everybody goes through it.
Exactly.
Regardless what's going on in their lives. Well, gosh, Paula, I think we have just enough time to talk a little bit about if you wanted to share any tips for our listeners that maybe they're going through like sadness or depression or just grief right now, other than picking up your book. What are some tips that they can use to kind of move through all that?
Well, one of the things that's another one of my passions in teaching people is what I have found over and over again. I know we've all experienced it. You hear about someone that you care about who's experienced a loss, and you want to reach out, you want to help them, but you don't know what to do. You don't know what to say, and you don't want to say the wrong thing and make it worse. So one of the things I would love to offer your listeners is a little free gift that's available. If they go to paulashaw.com, on my home page there, they can fill in their email address, and they will get a piece that I've written that's one of my favorites. It's called 20 Things to Say and Not to Say to People in Pain. And I love this because it's very specific. I give you actual statements to please avoid so you won't abuse anybody in pain. And those are things like what we were just talking about, it just takes time, or God must have needed him more than you did. Those kinds of things that make the person in pain feel defensive or angry, that's not helpful. But to let them know that you're there with them And the other thing I really want to say to people who are trying to help someone in emotional pain is the most important thing you can say is nothing. The most important thing you can do is listen. Get them to talk. Get them to speak about their feelings, what they're experiencing, what happened. That is the most helpful thing you can do. So you don't need to worry about what's the perfect thing to say and what's the perfect thing to do. Just be there with your heart, be present, and listen. And that is incredibly helpful, incredibly helpful.
Well, Paula, thank you so much for sharing all of your good information with us, especially on this topic. It's such a deep topic, and taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Well, it was my pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity, Marianne, because as I was saying, it is my passion to help people understand grief and to know that it doesn't have to be a life sentence. But we do have to take action. We do have to do things to work through it so we don't become a monument to despair. So we can actually come to the other side and be wiser and have greater character and more gratitude and a greater ability to appreciate life.
Well, thank you, Paula. I so appreciate you taking your time and sharing your insights with us. Unfortunately, that's the end of our time today. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Thursday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.